Welcome to Dialogues in Afro-Latinidad, a podcast dedicated to amplifying and elevating Afro-Latin American and Afro-Latinx histories, cultures, and communities. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Reed-Vasquez. Join us for conversations with experts and artists to learn more about Afro-Latinidad. Venga. I'm excited to welcome today's guest, Professor Tanya K. Hernández. She is the Archibald R. Murray Professor of Law at Fordham University School of Law, where she is an Associate Director of the Center on Race, Law, and Justice. She is a Fulbright Scholar who holds an AB from Brown University and a JD from Yale University. Her fellowships include being a Law and Public Policy Affairs Fellow at Princeton University and a Scholar in Residence at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Professor Hernández is a Fellow of the American Bar Foundation and the American Law Institute. Her books include Racial Subordination in Latin America, The Role of the State, Customary Law and the New Civil Rights Response, with Spanish and Portuguese editions, Brill Research Perspectives in Comparative Law, Racial Discrimination, Multiracials and Civil Rights, Mixed Race Stories of Discrimination, and her most recent book from Beacon Press, Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias and the Struggle for Equality. Tanya, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
So we're going to jump right in. So you grew up in New York City in Hell's Kitchen, and your family's from Puerto Rico, from Toa Alta. How did your early life shape your professional interests in Afro-Latin American and Afro-Latinx communities?
Well, growing up in New York City, I was sort of lucky that there was a, sizable Puerto Rican community and people from other parts of the Caribbean and Latin America all within my neighborhood. And that was lovely. But part of what that meant was sort of having a little Puerto Rico inside of New York City is that I was exposed to all of not only the cultural aspects, but the racial attitudes that are part of our culture. So what I mean by that is I grew up hearing sort of the schizophrenia with regards to race issues. On one side, we thought of ourselves as superior to people in the United States, Americanos, North Americans, conceived of primarily as white. And we didn't have their racial problems because we didn't see the world in white and black. And, racism was a problem of the United States. So I'd hear that sort of, out of one side of the mouth of a speaker. And within the next sentence, there would be all this anti-Black sentiment being expressed regarding Afro-Latinos and African-Americans and Africans, anyone of African ancestry as Blackness as being negative. And so, it seemed to me a very odd dichotomy to, be thinking of ourselves as racially superior, and then at the same time embodying blatant anti-Black attitudes that, as when I was growing up, were becoming viewed as problematic with regards to English speakers. And so to hear it in Spanish, just sort of all very blatant, was quite striking to me. And so that was always something I noticed growing up, right? That dichotomy. And then as a professional, what disturbed me was that as a legal scholar focusing on issues of civil rights and discrimination and equality, I was starting to see how Latinos who would be brought into court and accused of being racially biased and being complicit in forms of racial exclusion based on someone's Black ancestry, that these Latinos would sometimes raise the issue of being Latino as a defense to accusation of racism. And then I started to see that there were juries and even some judges who thought of that as palatable, that Latinos could have a off-ramp from being held accountable for partaking in dynamics of racial exclusion, all circling back to the Latino, what I let's call Latino racial innocence, this idea of, oh, no, not us, we couldn't possibly. And so I saw my personal history becoming relevant within my professional research context. And that is what sort of really became a mission on my part, to have my work as a scholar have an activist component with regards to trying to both illuminate this problematic dynamic, and also try to find a path forward to thinking, how do we work our way through this?
Mm. Well, and I mean, again, it's interesting. I've talked to a lot of people, and that those early personal understandings really do resonate in the way that they are shaped into their professional work. I know that you're really excited about the way that your work on Afro-Latinidad has resonated with a larger public, that you see that as, and you get to see how passionate they are about this topic. I wonder if you could say a bit more about how you were drawn to the legal arena in particular, and the evolution of your work in that field.
Well, I always wanted to do something that would be helpful in the world. And what drew me to law, it was sort of an indirect path because I didn't know any lawyers. I'm first generation to college, let alone to law school. And so I didn't have a model of what it meant to be a lawyer within my networks, to put it lightly. But I knew I wanted to be of service in some way. And it was my educators, people both in high school and in college, that encouraged me to pursue law. One in part because I cared about social issues, and I was very much someone who was animated with the life of the mind, reading and writing. And so they were the ones, my educators, who said, look, we think you've got something here and we think you should pursue it as a lawyer. And so I went sort of in blind faith based on what they told me, that this would be a good path for me. And I never looked back. It was, transformative, and a place that I really love being. Now, if I can just sort of reflect back for a second on what you just mentioned, this idea about how much the work has resonated. I'm a lawyer, I'm a legal scholar, and this is not something that in a bookstore reading you find many people who are lawyers being. I'm not James Patterson. I'm not Nicholas Spark or anything like that. However, what I have found is that there is a population that is hungry to see in-depth assessments, analysis, and conversation about the Afro-Latino experience. And when my book came out just last year in the hardcover, and then come out later in August again in paperback, what I found fascinating is that I expected some resistance. Essentially the book is about all the ways in which Latinos are complicit in anti-blackness in the workplace, in schools, in denying access to public spaces of leisure, hotels, public accommodations, and as well as Latinos being part of law enforcement and enforcing, rules of white supremacy and Black exclusion. That in all those spheres, Latinos are part and parcel of what the systems of racism are within the United States. And while the book certainly is designed to be accessible, it's very much in the vein of critical race theory narrative form, meaning that I'm talking about law, but I'm doing it by talking about people's stories. And so I'm trying to lift up, the Afro-Latino and other subjects of African descent within the book. So I expected pushback. I've expected Latinos who either don't racially identify or identify as white, or mestizo in some way, to say to me, no, you're mistaken. This isn't a problem. Or if it's a problem, it's a minor problem. It's not like the real problem of white Anglo-English speaking discrimination against Latinos proper. Right? So I expected that, and I've seen some of that. What I had not expected was the way in which at public book events that there would be people who were not only excited about the book, but had already purchased a copy of the book, had read the book and had it outlined and, dog-eared, and, they were bringing in well-loved copies of their books to talk to me and have me sign. But also, let me give you an example. As a scholar, I'm used to a question and answer session. What people ask me about why I think the way I do, why did I say what I said, that sort of thing. Question and answer sessions for this book have been so different because they're more like, how should I call, people testifying in church, right, or a place of religious worship, where they're essentially not quizzing me, but instead supporting the ideas in the book with reflections on how it actually speaks to something directly within their own life experience and things that they're encountering right now. And so the outpouring of love and also of sort of relief, some people are very emotional when they come to the book events. They are sort of breathing a sigh of, wow, finally, someone has articulated what I've long been experiencing, but I didn't necessarily have a language or a grammar to express it, because in the United States, when we talk about discrimination, it's always this idea of this is something that white, English-speaking Anglos do to people of color generally, and not what people of color, let alone Latinos, are complicit in.
Yeah, exactly. I can imagine what that looks like, having been at a book signing as well. How because these are, and from what I've been hearing, what I see, there's not enough conversation, there's not enough information, and so people are active and interested, and so I can totally see them wanting to share their story because there's so few spaces for those stories to be shared.
Well, and the other thing, I'm sorry.
No.
The other thing I just wanted to add on to that is that, what is, I think, really quite relevant is that while there's some conversation, certainly after 2020 and Latinos being part of Black Lives Matter movements, that provided a little more space, right, for Afro-Latinos to discuss and express the ways in which they are racially distinguishable and differentiated from other Latinos, that those conversations are often very limited in as much as it's Afro-Latinos talking about the I, meaning my personal experience, I feel, which is important, right? But it gets sidelined because it's dismissed as, well, that's your individual take on things. And what I think so many readers are responding to, as far as the Racial Innocence book is concerned, is that for the first time, the book takes a huge, large landscape picture of all those eyes, right? Meaning, so you're no longer having to go into a room with just your personal experience and your personal feelings. What the book provides is a way of seeing systems and patterns, right, of how Latinos are part of an anti-Black sentiment and exclusion. And so you're no longer, in some respects, alone in the conversation. You've got documented sort of empirics to help you navigate the anti-Blackness and the denial of it that these conversations often sort of bring out.
Yeah, and I think along those lines, as your work as a scholar and educator, how would you say your work contributes to our understanding of these communities, Afro-Latinx, Afro-Latin American? Given the systems and patterns that you point out.
I guess the main thing I would say is that the way the book sort of provides a contribution is that we often think of Latinidades as being about culture, our language, our food, our music, our dance. And left off the table is the way in which culture also includes racial attitudes. And racial attitudes that are not really benign and are not merely about aesthetics, who we find pretty, who do we want to date, that sort of thing. They also are very much about how hierarchy and social order is regulated in ways that affect people's lives, how much money you are able to bring into your household, where you're able to live, how much you are able to keep yourself safe and amidst higher vulnerability to law enforcement violence against you because of your appearance in a Black body. Right? All of these things are part of what Latino culture, right, is implicated in, but often is not viewed as much. And so, for instance, Hispanic Heritage Month every September 15th to October 15th really has this conversation, right? And so that's one way in which I see the book having a contribution that is distinctive, although certainly part of a larger literature and burgeoning literature that I'm very excited to be seeing so many scholars being part of.
No, definitely. And I also want to ask, thinking about all those features of Latinidad, what you think, and the way that race fits into that, what do you think are some of the most urgent issues then facing Afro-Latinx communities, especially as they relate to your work?
I think one of the most urgent issues is our need to be vigilant and active in resisting how the pan-ethnic umbrella of Latinx is seeking to make Afro-Latino invisible. Right? And not in a, and here's why we have to be so vigilant, because often the push to silence Afro-Latino subjects is coming from a place of, we care, but we have to give primacy, right, to the more racially unidentifiable picture of Latinidad, meaning a colorblind vision of Latino, because we are under siege. We are being victimized through immigration law. And, that's all true, right? But at the same time, it means that all the ways in which Afro-Latinos are particularly vulnerable to violence, to exclusion, to being paid less, that these things are sort of taking a backseat in ways that harm us even more. Right? And so Afro-Latinos have to be very vigilant about the way in which our Latino leaders are trying to make sure that they are not held accountable, right, for a more intersectional, it's not just about ethnicity of Latinidad, it's also about race within Latinidades. And so, one quick example is the current debate that's happening with regards to the census. Right now, the census asks two questions. One, are you of Hispanic origin as an ethnicity? And then two, within your Hispanic ethnicity, what is your sort of primary racial affiliation? And you get to choose as many as you like: white, Black, Asian, Indigenous, etc. And mainstream Latino organizations have been supportive of a government proposal to collapse those questions into one single question. So now what's being proposed, like for the 2030 census, would be, what race or ethnicity, whatever you want to call it, do you identify with? White, Black, Latino, Asian, Indigenous, etc. And so this would put Latino as something separate apart from Blackness in ways, that I don't think it takes a rocket science to see that it's read as Black is not Latino, Black is African American. And so don't check this, only check Latino. Why do we care? We should care because as Afro-Latinos, the census data is what helps measure exclusion and inclusion. So with the current way, with the two-question setup, we're able to see both how Latinos get access to mortgages, but also how within Latino communities, Black Latinos don't get the same access as white Latinos, despite having similar socioeconomic status profiles. When that happens, that's an invitation for the Department of Justice to make a discrimination inquiry. Right? the data matters for both being able to document where racial exclusion is happening, and also give government officials and civil rights organizations quantitative data with which to do investigations into intentional discrimination, right? Or just patterns and practices of systemic exclusion. So, it sounds very nerdy, but at the same time, it is a crucial matter that could statistically make Afro-Latinos invisible, and the way in which we are situated differently in ways that hurt us within a racial hierarchy. We're not all Latinos. Some people may think, oh, well, Latino, isn't that kind of like a shade of brown? Whereas, founder of Afro-Latino studies, the late Miriam Jimenez Roman, would always say, some browns are browner than other browns. This brown hides a world of sins. And so the thing that I would say Afro-Latinos have to be most concerned with right now, right, is this issue of statistical invisibility, because that would hinder, right, our ability to be able to keep track of how we are not being treated the same as other Latinos.
I think you've raised really important points about the measurement, about measuring visibility and invisibility. And again, these stories, these personal stories translate into these measurements, our ability to measure and to not measure. And if you're not looking to, and I get this a lot in my work where grants and things, they want to know how you're measuring the results. And so to see, so when the census piece came up, because I've been following that as well, I was like, what? Why this is not good? We're going to miss a whole swath of people if we don't allow for a deeper understanding, a deeper racial understanding of Latinidad that really allows folks who are of African descent to indicate the multiple spaces in which they occupy, the intersectionality that you mentioned. So I'm excited about the possibilities, although also frustrated about the possibilities about what's going to emerge from the census. But like you, I think it's really crucial to have these kinds of measurements, to get a sense, to get a snapshot of what's going on right now in the 21st century.
Most definitely. I mean, I'll give you one brief example. There are parts of the country in which Afro-Latinos actually have higher rates of formal education as opposed to non-racially identified or white identified Latinos. But despite having higher education rates in some of these geographic spaces, these same Afro-Latinos have lower returns on their investment. Now, that's a fancy economics way to say that even though they have higher rates of formal education, they don't get paid the same, meaning they don't get the benefit of the college degree, the doctoral degree, as other Latinos, because, and it leaves open the question, is it race? Well, it certainly doesn't take, I think, that much of a powerhouse mode of analysis to say, what's different here and what's the same, right? And so in the absence of any other concrete explanation, we are left with, it looks like their racial appearance is doing some work here as far as subordination is concerned.
Well, I mean, I could talk to you all day, but I'm wrapping up to my kind of final questions. And I want to ask, in addition to your publications and articles, what other kinds of resources would you recommend to people who want to learn more about Afro-Latinx, Afro-Latin American communities more broadly?
I would recommend that they go to the Afro-Latino Forum website. Because in the Afro-Latino Forum, the organization that Miriam Jimenez Roman, the mother of Afro-Latino studies, founded, there are lots of resources, materials to read, videos, etc., to give people a deeper sense of what some of the politics of this are. I mean, because I'll just say this last thing. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful thing that there's more space now to talk about Afro-Latino culture, so that we are sort of getting a little more space to be able to lay claim to the ways in which our contributions to Latinidades are marked and significant, but this is something that we need to think about beyond just the arts. Right? Afro-Latino, the experience also matters with regards to politics. And so the Afro-Latino Forum does both. And so that's, I think, a good website to check out, along with the more narrowly focused a coalition of organizations that are all gathered within the website latinoisnotaRace.info. There you'll find lots of materials about sort of helping to explain the significance of this census battle, and also how one might be part of the activism with regards to trying to make sure we are not statistically erased.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for sharing your passion, your journey, and for all the fantastic scholarship, and for your activism in the field.
Oh, thank you so much, Michelle. It was a delight to talk with you. And I just want to say to the listeners, watch out for August 3rd, 2023. That's when the paperback release of Racial Innocence, Unmasking Anti-Black Bias comes out.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of Dialogues in Afro-Latinidad, please subscribe to our podcast and tell a friend. For links to the resources mentioned in the interview, visit our website at michellereedvasquez.com/podcast.